The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
More than half the world is voting this year.
More than 50 nations will decide who rules them through the ballot box.
But democracy is under threat.
Disillusion with politicians and their failure to tackle the big problems is spreading.
Can a government work if it's led by people who only seek to win the next election?
Autocracies like China claim their system works better.
And even the beacons of democracy, like the United States, are challenged by those who refuse to play by the rules.
Are we falling out of love with a system that promises us all a say but fails to deliver what we want?
Is democracy failing?
The Y Curve.
I mean, it is a big question, isn't it? It's the only system we've got.
It's the only system we've got at the moment.
Yeah.
But it could change. I mean, the problem really with the whole thing is that you've got disillusion. People thinking that actually most, in Britain, we feel a lot of the system is broken in various ways. In the US, they're even fighting whether to keep people on the ballot or not, a certain Mr. Trump.
Yeah.
And it's not doing what it's supposed to do. People are manoeuvring it, that our own government is perhaps really just manoeuvring to try and win the next election rather than thinking further ahead in what they might actually do to help the country.
So then we've then got to ask the question, is it the politicians we're getting? Why are politicians there? Like Rishi Sunak, you get the impression really he's there because it looks good on his CV. I mean, has he really got the interest of the country at heart?
Well, we don't know. We can't see inside his soul, I suppose. And I think, but we get the politicians that you get as a result of the system you've got, fundamentally. People say, the politicians in the past, the Churchills, the rest were of a much bigger stature and more long-sighted. But I'm not sure that's true.
And for whatever reason now, we seem to think people who bend the rules are good. So Donald Trump is trying to beat the system. It's like saying, well, the system is wrong, vote for me and I will use the system against itself almost. But
he's also moving towards pretty much openly talking about a non-democratic system. I mean, he said, asked, will he be a dictator? I'll be a dictator for one day, he said. Well, I mean, God knows what he means, but it's still a worrying thing. And the fact is his supporters staged something entirely undemocratic in 2020. So what are we going towards? And meanwhile, places like Russia and China can say, well, we don't need to think in these short-term ideas. We can, plan 5-year plans in China. Russia, theoretically, is still a democracy, but no one's in any great illusion about that.
No. Yeah, I mean, you're willing to challenge, obviously, so long as you're prepared to go to prison for it. So what was that Peter Cook movie? I'm trying to remember the one where he becomes a dictator. He basically allows people to vote. You must have seen this movie. He allows everybody to vote. It's a classic movie. I would just wish I should have done some research and actually worked out the name.
It's always a plus, yeah.
He basically allows people to vote on everything. So it's too much of a democracy in a way. People get so sick. There's this great scene where there's this couple who are sort of like staying up late at night because everyone's having masses of paperwork delivered to their home, and there's this couple in a 2 up, 2 down, and the woman's there saying, I think I did well to go hard on China. Of course you were. You were right, darling. So everyone's making all these big decisions, and in the end, they all just got jack of it. And in the end, so he says there will be one last vote, and that vote will be that there will never be another election. Ooh. And so he's positioned himself into a democracy, and this came
into a dictatorship.
Into a dictatorship, I should say. And this came from a man who sort of came from an advertising background, so he sort of knew how to play people. It's a classic movie.
But that is definitely the way it looks like things are tended, because even in democracies, there's this trend towards what they call illiberal democracy. So places like Hungary, for example, where it is a democracy, but it kind of isn't.
Yeah.
And you get to a point where really the nature of what makes a democracy is tending to ebb away. And it seems that many people quite like it. There was a terrifying poll, I think it was in the UK, suggesting that, that a very large number of people would prefer to have a strong leader than a healthy democracy. You can see why, in the sense if you say, a strong leader could do things and these people can't.
Yeah.
But what if you get someone you don't really like? You can't change it.
Yeah, exactly. And, we've got one of those
in
the UK at the moment. Someone who's
we can get rid of him in theory.
Yeah, we've just got to wait a while. Yeah. I think also, there's an issue, and we'll get on to our guest in just a second, but something else which is worth exploring. How much of, what we rely on day to day, are we getting democracy confused with sort of day-to-day operations? So there's an argument that could say, well, if we could just chalk out the right amount of money for the NHS and for other essential services, do they need to be political? you know, if there's a general acceptance that we want a national health service, how much does it cost to run? Let's just wave it off to one side, make sure that there's the money available to provide that. And similarly for other areas of government, it's when you start to get...
Well, you decide how much. I mean, how much is a reasonable amount?
It's a long-term decision. It's not a year-to-year decision.
But it's also a decision about how much it actually provides. We won't get into the NHS now, but the point is, you know, what should the NHS be providing and what shouldn't it be providing?
But we're getting politicians making short-term decisions on things which are long-term solutions.
That's the fundamental, and that's why the whole idea of this, you know, we're a democracy once every 5 years, used to work, but now if people are simply thinking about the opinion polls, it kind of doesn't. Let's dig into this anyway, and the problems with democracy and where it's going, with Natasha Lindstaet, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Essex, and she joins us now.
So, Natasha, I mean, the Chinese obviously think they've got a better system and that democracy is riddled with all sorts of flaws, one of which, of course, you know, we've just been talking about is the fact that it's very short-term in its thinking. So, I mean, have they got a point, actually? That is the biggest problem, isn't it? We lurch from election to election, whereas, you know, if it was a benevolent dictator, maybe it would make more headway.
Right. I mean, that's a really good question about whether or not democracy can deliver, particularly when there's all these elections. And in some cases, like, you know, in the US, you have elections for the House of Representatives every 2 years. People are constantly campaigning. It's difficult to build any kind of long-term plan. But honestly, countries like China are really more the outliers that are authoritarian and actually benevolent dictatorships, in the sense that they're at least trying to pursue some kind of development for their people. And it comes with, of course, huge costs. In the case of China, you have more executions there than anywhere in the world. And if we were actually just to look at on average how dictatorships perform, they perform much worse economically than democracies do. They perform worse on almost every different type of indicator that we might measure.
Well, you say that, but if you look at China, I mean, that is the second largest economy in the world, projected at some point to become the largest, potentially, although there's some question mark about that now. I mean, she's not doing badly, is it?
I mean, masses of people moved into the middle class from poverty.
Yeah, that's true. China moved 400, 500, maybe even 600 million people out of poverty. Some of China's accomplishments have been astounding, but for every country like China or like Singapore, you have countries like Chad or Nicaragua or Venezuela that are actually plunging their citizens in much deeper into poverty. And you can even compare some authoritarian regimes where they're not doing that badly, or that the people living in them have access to healthcare and have high levels of development, but they actually underperform compared to democracies of similar per capita income levels. On other indicators like health indicators like maternal death rate and infant mortality rate, child mortality rate. So I think you do have authoritarian regimes that perform well, but you have a lot more that don't.
But if we're looking across the whole world at the moment, this is an extraordinary year because we've got more than half the world's population voting, 50 countries, 4 billion people, I think, actually going to the polls theoretically. But democracy does look to be in challenge, not least because many of the people who are voting in countries where there's no real democracy, or the outcome is very clear as to what the outcome will be in the vote, or they're illiberal democracies in which the democratic values aren't really adhered to. So it's a bit of a distortion. Do you think democracy's in trouble at the moment?
Oh, it's in huge trouble. In fact, scholars of democracy have been commenting on this for probably 10 years now, that it's been facing a huge democratic slump. In fact, if you look at the Varieties of Democracy Index that looks at all the countries in the world historically, they're saying that we live for the first time at levels of democracy around the level of 1986, that 72% of the world's population is living in authoritarian regimes, and there's more authoritarian regimes in the world than democracies. So we haven't had this in decades. We see that many countries that were even staunchly democratic are backsliding into more authoritarian styles of government, and people are embracing it. It's not just that the leaders or would-be autocrats are pushing us in this direction, that there's an appetite for this. in the public. So it's definitely a period of democratic decline.
So the system has failed somewhere along the line. Then, if people are asking for it as though they've, we've tried capitalism, we've tried a market economy, it's not working for us.
Yeah, I think it's complicated, the answer here, because you have some countries that are newer democracies and their institutions haven't been built up yet, and they haven't had a chance to really deliver on things, and people have been nostalgic for authoritarian systems because they think this would bring them more security, more stability, job security, and so forth. So you have these newer democracies that are really struggling, but you have since the global economic crisis happened, and democracies in particular really failed to listen to their public, their citizens. This has led to a lot of angst, and people have sought non-democratic alternatives in many cases.
So what is it that went wrong in that? You mentioned that, in the economic crisis, they didn't listen, yet they were democracies. They are supposed to be accountable. Is there some problem in the mechanism of democracy at heart that is what is causing the dissolution?
Yeah, I think, parties have just decayed. They haven't been representing people that well. We've seen a rise of personalism, of people, I guess, seeking out messianic types of figures that are going to solve all their problems. And we've also seen just a failure to educate democracies, like democratic populations, about what democracy is. It's not about necessarily some sort of magic formula that you're going to get economic growth and everybody's going to be happy. It's just the idea that the people should be more involved in this in decision making, and that we should build up institutions that aren't always going to come up with a quick fix, but that it's going to require more long-term investment. So some of these moves of these countries moving towards more autocratic forms of government, they're really moving towards more of these populist style autocratic forms of government that are promising quick fixes that haven't really delivered on this either. So I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what democracy is supposed to do and deliver.
Well, isn't populism actually what democracy is? The clue is in the word. If people are popular, they will be elected and supported. If they're not popular, they won't. That is kind of what democracy is.
I think some early definitions of populism have talked about this, that this idea it's like a grassroots movement that are bottom up, where people can come together and actually pressure for whatever they're wanting, and not having to only have the decisions being made by elites. But populism is sort of transformed, morphed, mutated into something different. And so the way we often refer to authoritarian populism is this idea that someone's going to come in and criticize elites and experts and really erode at institutions and be directly responsible for making these quick decisions that are not really about what long-term development needs, but about like, how can I, provide some kind of quick fix? And all the more they're increasing their own personal power at the expense of democratic institutions.
And maybe their own personal wealth as well. Isn't that a big part of the difference? I mean, are we finding that in some parts of the world, in many parts of the world perhaps, we've got people who become dictators because they think that, perhaps with support from the public, because they talk about a quick fix, but really what they're talking about is how can we benefit for ourselves from this rather than having the interest of the country at heart.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That you have leaders, as they erode at democratic institutions that are really important for checking their own power and keeping them in check, or to highlight, scandals or acts of corruption. They're able to enrich themselves, tremendously in some cases, and they embezzle funds or siphon money directly from the state, and are able to do so because there's just not the ways of keeping them accountable. This is more likely to happen in weak democracies, but look at what happened in the case of Trump in the U.S.
Well, I was going to come to that because it did sound as we were talking there.
I know.
And I assume, Natasha, is that your part of the world originally?
Yeah, I'm from California. I've grown up in the U.S. and I've been living in the U.K. for the last 15 years.
What do you? The current problem with the U.S. Obviously, as an outsider, seems to be the U.S. system seems to be that you have someone who does not play by the rules that we've thought were there, but somehow still succeeds. Now, does that suggest that the system of checks and balances, the Constitution, everything else in the US, is that the problem? The actual formal mechanisms of the democracy just aren't working? So
they're working a little bit. It's kind of complicated because on some levels I see what's going on in the US and it just feels like we're about to fall to a dictatorship in 2024. It's very scary. Some of the things that Trump is promising, that he'll be dictator for at least a day, that he's going to weaponize the justice system, go after his enemies and so forth. But there are institutions. We have free speech. We are trying to protect democracy. There are a lot of people trying to protect democracy, at least in the U.S. case. But one of the things that's probably hard maybe for someone from the outside to understand, sometimes even for me to understand, is Trump has built a personality cult. I mean, like a personality cult like you would see in a dictatorship. There's no other way to describe it, that there is at least 30% of the public that is absolutely transfixed by everything he says, believes whatever he says, no matter how ridiculous or outrageous the lies are. And believes that you need some sort of autocratic form of government in order to ensure that Trump, who is their messiah, their savior, remains in power. We've never really seen something quite like this before.
No, and part of his argument is, well, I've got to cheat the system to make the system work, isn't it? And we saw a bit of that with Boris Johnson as well, who really was, Donald Trump in short pants. I mean, exactly the same situation. It was the cult of personality, and that's, that has to be a big risk for democracy, mustn't it? In this internet age where we are easily hoodwinked by personality over substance.
Yes, I mean, I think you're right that some of the biggest threats to democracy is the rise of personalism in general. And we see that this is a trend that for those that study comparative politics, that's really alarming, because it's basically the opposite of the rule of law, of institutions, of things that we need to ensure that there isn't corruption and favoritism. So we have huge rise of personalism everywhere. And just to touch on something else you mentioned, the rise of misinformation. We didn't have this to this extent. You had one sort of source for the news. There were almost like guardians ensuring that editing and that information that was out there was more truthful, or at least we could say was more truthful, comparatively speaking. And we have now an explosion of fake news or of false news or misleading information that people get. And I think dictatorships in particular, and would-be autocrats, have really understood the power of propaganda and how you can shape people's minds and hearts so easily. You don't even have to tell the truth. You don't even have to sound like you're telling the truth. I mean, countries like Russia, like China, are excellent at doing this. But we see would-be autocrats, like in the case of the U.S. under Trump. He's been also an expert at utilizing propaganda to transfix his supporters.
So is there a sense that you could say that the internet tech is enabling, or perhaps even encouraging, this move away from democracy for those reasons you're saying, that actually the problem, the reason things have changed, the reason democracy is at threat, is simply because of the way that fakery and misinformation can get out there in a way it never could before?
And if people are basing their decisions on false ideas, does it make any difference actually whether you've got a dictatorship or a democracy if you can mold people in that way?
I mean, these are really good questions. There was this idea that social media was going to be so great for democracy, that as people could share and spread information about democratic norms, that this would then lead to a cascade of different, revolutions, starting with like the Arab Spring and all the hope that there was with the Arab Spring. And we see how that ended. And we're seeing social media has actually been turned on its head and been used more by dictatorships or by forces, anti-democratic forces, to spread information, to flood the population with information that basically confuses them, or to just spread false information and use that to legitimize their rule. And people are willing to believe whatever they want to. So it's very difficult to have a true democracy when people don't have access to accurate information.
And yet, the counter to that would be people should be smart enough to be able to understand what's real and what's not. And you should be able to vote for whoever you think is the most appropriate person to lead the country. And if you're driven by, if you think a strong personality is part of that, if you feel that, someone who can knock down barriers to get things done is the way forward, then shouldn't you be able to vote for that person?
Yeah, and this isn't the first time that information has been controlled in this way. You think of Nazi Germany, you think of Stalin's Russia, where information was completely controlled. In a way, now we have access to lots of information from lots of different sources.
Right, that's true. But dictators have gotten really adept at using social media to directly target their supporters, use propaganda and so forth, and have been able to get the same types of results. So in some ways, we don't really have totalitarian regimes like we used to have, with the exception of North Korea, of course, in the past, where people were being completely controlled by both propaganda and secret police, but they've been able to harness technology in other ways. We have facial recognition systems. The Chinese government in particular is really good at knowing exactly what its citizens are doing, and it is an expert at propaganda. I mean, they teach other countries about how to use propaganda effectively to convey certain messages, and they've used polling data to find that this propaganda that they've used has been effective in getting the Chinese population to be more supportive of Xi Jinping in particular, but of the Communist Party.
And isn't there also a risk that in trying to fight this trend, there's a risk that the other side, if you like, the theoretically more democratic side, slip into anti-democratic things as well? I'm thinking at the moment, particularly for people trying to take Donald Trump's name off the ballot in certain states in the US. And as you know, this is a very contentious issue at the moment. But that sounds to an outsider, you're not allowing people to vote for someone. You're not allowing someone to be on the ballot. Sounds anti-democratic in itself.
It does sound anti-democratic, but I guess you have to think of it this way, that this was a person who is being accused of encouraging an insurrection. And so there have been much, let's say, less harsh reasons why people have been pushed off a ballot than trying to orchestrate a coup. I mean, trying to undermine the very institutions that democracy hinges on, which are elections. So he's a dangerous individual, a really, really dangerous person. Now, I think it would backfire if the Supreme Court decided that he couldn't be on the ballot, and I don't think that's what they're going to do.
But is he the first of many, though? I mean, if it's not Donald Trump, he's shown, and we've seen it in other parts of the world as well, if you've got a strong personality who can cajole people through social media and can run over the media and try and push this, this bully boy image to their benefit, that is a roadmap to success.
Yeah, because you've got Narendra Modi in India is another one who seems to be, it's a democracy. It's the world's biggest democracy. But he seems to be a very dominant figure. We've seen it in the Philippines with Duterte. People can use the existing mechanisms to get what they want in a very undemocratic way.
Right. I mean, I think Trump himself has followed his own blueprint. I think he's been inspired by leaders like Hitler and Stalin. I mean, he so much has said this, and other leaders have been inspired by Trump by using the words fake news. We see with Bolsonaro in Brazil, he was referred to as the tropical Trump. You rightly give the example of Duterte in the Philippines. And what are the toolbox that Trump uses to maintain himself in power? A lot of leaders have drawn from this and taken strength from the way that he's handled things, with his sort of straight talk that seems to appeal to the common man, while going on these corruption binges, and that he's just completely defiant. And I think a lot of leaders have been inspired by this.
So what's the antidote? How do we stop that happening again and again? I mean, because if it just keeps on happening, it is a big challenge. As we started this conversation, it's a big challenge to democracy.
It is. I mean, I was going to say before, this is the one silver lining, or let's just say light at the end of the tunnel, is that democracy goes in phases. And there are autocratic swings and democratic swings. And so we are in the middle of a democratic slump, but we'll likely go back to a democratic wave as there's been backlash to them. We saw that in 2019 in particular was called the year of the protests. There were a lot of protests in many, many countries around the world. People had it. And we're seeing more and more, even in autocratic countries, where you're taking on huge risks. If you look in the case of Iran, in some of those protests that started in September 2022, that people are willing to take on huge risks to fight for important freedoms and just basic human rights that democracies are supposed to offer. So I would imagine there'll be a point where there will be a backlash against this autocratic trend.
But if it works, I mean, you mentioned Iran, but they've been protesting for a long time, and particularly after that lady was killed, and there was a huge upsurge of protest against the religious establishment. But it hasn't worked. I mean, the Iranian government is still there.
Right. So, I mean, I wouldn't predict anytime soon a country as authoritarian as Iran is going to get overturned by protests. There's absolutely really no chance of that happening, or in Russia for that matter. But I'm talking about in some of these regimes that are somewhere in the gray zone, in the middle, that have had a history of democracy and have been autocratizing, that we may see a pushback. I mean, you could see, like in the recent elections in Poland, there was a bit of a pushback from the far right populist parties. And we may see that again in the U.S. and in other places in Europe and possibly in Latin America. I'm not saying it's happened yet, but I think that there's only a matter of time where people will have had enough of this.
Do we give too much power to politicians in democratic regimes? Do we give too much control to Donald Trump, for example? So if you think about it, if you were running a company, if you were the CEO, you'd have to answer to a board. Now, that board doesn't, you could say, well, okay, the board is the people of the country, but the board for a company doesn't meet every 5 years. And when they do, they're meeting every month or every quarter at least, and they are quizzing the CEO. But everyone's on the same side. So it's not a political confrontation like we see through democracy. So is there, I'm just wondering what we can learn from
politics itself be reformed?
I'm trying to see if there's a way that we run businesses that could actually apply to the way that we run countries. So there's more of a devolution of power.
Well, the U.S. definitely needs huge reform. And honestly, we just never have had a leader that was this self-centered, this corrupt, this dictatorial before. I mean, he shattered so many of our norms. We didn't have rules or laws in places, but we're going to need them to deal with this type of personality that is a very, very dangerous person. I mean, I can't think of any president in U.S. history that has been this dangerous and this committed to just taking down the entire country for his own personal gain.
And yet loved by so many Americans.
And yet loved by at least 30%, really, truly loved by 30%.
And they're not stupid. I met quite a few of them. They're not stupid people. I mean, it surprises me how seemingly intelligent people are big, strong Trump supporters.
Well, I think he taps into something that they may not want to always articulate, but I think he taps into, some of them it's just think that he just does a better job of running the economy. But I think a lot of it is about people's fears of their identity being lost. That, the U.S. is a very diverse country. Whites will not be the majority. We will have more and more people from all over the world, but particularly from from the Hispanic community. And people seem to be just deathly afraid of this. And they want someone like Trump who's going to say he's going to put up walls and borders and prevent. I mean, he's using very dangerous language, drawing from Hitler and the like, talking about tainted blood and so forth. And people like this. This taps into their fears.
But isn't this part of the central core of the problem with democracy is that you have politicians who, whether 2 years in the case of Congress or 5 years, or whatever it is, need to keep an eye on the opinion polls the whole time in order to direct whatever it is they're doing. So therefore, that's what governs what they do rather than any desire
so it's all short term. It's too much democracy. They're just responding. Yeah. And that's was going to be a question I was going to raise. It's just about getting back to the whole idea of a CEO running a business. You've got a long-term view, whereas government is obviously short-term. And you look at, for example, in the UK, things like the National Health Service get politicised. And yet, if you ask everybody, they'd say, well, okay, that's a hands-off area. Let's just let it, let's take it out of politics. Let's just make sure it's got the resources that are needed. Let's work that out, what that's going to be for the next 10 years. And that just has to happen. And maybe that other areas of politics as well, or other areas of running a country, which can be depoliticized, that you just have a body that runs it, which is away from the government. So the government has to focus on things that it can influence or develop a longer term view rather than this short term view of changing stuff, which very often is core to, the operation of a country.
And I think you are asking a really good question about what elements of governance should be in the hands of technocrats or something like that.
Yes.
And I think actually any very successful country, there will be this technocratic element in the bureaucracy, in decision making, in policy making, where you really do have experts. But that's the danger of these populist autocratic forms of governance. And what Trump did, I mean, he just wasn't filling positions with experts. He was either filling them with his cronies or people that didn't have even a degree in the appropriate agency that was needed, or didn't even know the agency that they were running, or that were just directly loyal to him, or he just wouldn't fill the position itself. I mean, that's probably the biggest legacy, besides all the damage he's done to the judicial system, is by going after these agencies of expertise and hollowing them out.
But that's because he could, because the system allows him to. The American system as it exists allows him to do that. And isn't that one of the big problems, that if you had a system that was less perhaps susceptible to democratic oversight? I mean, in the US, you have it at a very basic level. You elect the sheriff, you elect the judge at so many different levels. We have less of that. But is that part of the problem? You need less, in a way, you need less democracy for democracy to survive.
Yes, I mean, it's a good question to think about when you have too much democracy, when you have referendums and referenda and leaders. Often these populist leaders have been successful in Turkey, for example, in Venezuela, using referenda, using too much democracy to dupe people and get people to vote for things and policies that actually benefit them. So we have these issues in the U.S. as well. I mean, but you have to understand the U.S. is such a complicated country because it's federal, because you have states with their own governments, with their own things that they're doing. And it varies from state to state. At the federal level, looking at the central government, there weren't the rules in place to prevent some of the things from happening. Or if the rules were in place, Trump would blatantly ignore them. And we've been struggling to go after him. I mean, he's facing over 91 counts here. It's not like we just let him get away with nothing. He has 4 criminal cases against him. It's just but it makes
no odds. If anything, it boosts him. So again, it's the democratic problem that if enough people, as you say, 30% love him, it's enough to propel him away from any of the rules in any way.
For those people, it's like, well, we are fighting the system, and the system is out to get him. Therefore, we're going to give him even more support. I mean, you can't win in that situation.
Yeah, you definitely can't win, but you still have a majority of the population in the U.S. that doesn't like him, that can't stand him, that he's awful.
Right. But he, of course, is, if you are in a smaller country and you're thinking, my retirement plan, I might become a dictator, you'll be looking at Donald Trump and saying, well, OK, there's the example. Democracy has failed. It's very easy now for anyone anywhere in the world to say, well, democracy isn't a great system, and point to America.
Yeah, I think that's been a major issue, that, for many years when American democracy looked a little bit more admirable or aspiring, you had the level of democracy was also higher around the world, that people thought that this type of system was something that worked. And at the moment, there's been huge and understandable levels of criticism at the way the U.S. democracy is functioning, failing to represent people, leading to the rise of this populist autocrat, all kinds of tensions and clashes taking place. There are all kinds of other social issues, too, that we haven't resolved beyond the issues with Trump. So I think it doesn't look that attractive.
I also wonder how much of it gets down to global trade as well. If you've got a country which is not big on natural resources, that is struggling to make a trade surplus, probably got a fairly hefty trade deficit, having to borrow in American dollars, for example. I mean, these countries, particularly over the last few years, are really struggling, and democracy isn't going to fix that for them. And maybe that's why people look for autocratic leaders.
But you've got America that is pretty successful, and it seems to be moving towards autocracy. So, it doesn't necessarily work. I mean, I suppose the interesting thing in this, Natasha, is you've got, we look back to 1990, the end of the Cold War, the end of history famously was the suggestion that liberal democracy had won. I mean, it's only been 30 years or so, and we seem to be completely reversing that.
That's right. That's the trend. We're seeing a reversal. But as I said, I mean, try to focus on some potential, room for optimism here. I don't think this autocratic slump or democratic slump, whoever way you want to word it, is going to last forever. I think that this is a moment. It's a bad moment, but there is a lot of backlash to all the things that Trump has done. I mean, I'm not calling the U.S. an autocracy yet. I'm going to see what happens in 2024. At the moment, it's a democracy. You can say what you want to say. There's freedom of speech and press and so forth. And he is facing some form of accountability through all these legal issues and lawsuits, some of which that he's already lost. So I think we're just at the cusp of a very important moment. I do think 2024 in the U.S. that election is incredibly important.
Is there danger, final question, about autocracies teaming up against democracies? I mean, is that the way the world is going to be divided?
It already seems to be in some ways,
Yeah, it already is. They've already been doing this. This is already, you never would have seen it, let's just say during the Cold War, a country like Venezuela that wasn't necessarily, I mean, I know it purports itself to be socialist and so forth, aligning with Russia. They don't really have that much in common, except that they're autocratic. And that's what we're seeing, is that there is a balance of power taking place between regime types. And the other issue is that the democracies trade more now with autocracies than they do with democracies. And so we've seen a shift with both huge levels of autocratic cooperation. They're cooperating with each other, and they're working to undermine democratic regimes.
And it's autocracy without ideology, which is really interesting, because if we do think back to the Cold War, what you had was the large communist powers with a communist idea, and this is the future, this is what we're doing. But now it's not that. It's hard to say quite what it is, other than the idea that autocracy works.
Other than that, and also just the personalist, whatever the idea is of that particular leader. We've seen cult of personalities, personalist forms of dictatorship rising, like in the case of China, which is really more of a single party dictatorship, but there's been a personality cult developed under Xi Jinping, Putin in Russia. Things have been really personalized in Turkey under Erdogan, in Venezuela under, Chavez, and now Maduro. There isn't an ideology, you're right, but it's the ideology attached to that particular person.
Yeah, it is. So it's going to be interesting, isn't it, to see it is a pivotal
fascinating
year,
I think.
At least countries around the world can look at the UK and say, well, there's a country where democracy is working so well.
It's working better than most, so.
We'll see how it all comes out.
That sounds
Natasha,
tragic in itself.
Natasha, thank you so much for being with us. Really interesting. And, we will see. We'll come to you at the end of this year and see if your faith in the continuity of US democracy still holds good.
Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you.
So did you quite like the idea, Roger, of, in your retirement, perhaps becoming a dictator?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean,
look around the world. There's bound to be somewhere
I'm sure I could
a man like you.
Yes, a bit of...
You've got the whole BBC World Service. You're a known entity.
I'm kind of a voice already, so I just, grab the podium.
Short step.
Yes, wave my fist up and down, and people will march in step with me. No, I don't think so. I just wouldn't have the confidence. This is one of the things. You have to be very confident to be a dictator, I suspect. Yeah. You have to think you are right about everything.
Despite all the contrary evidence. That's
indeed.
Right. Yeah,
indeed. Well, anyway, from one sort of potential disaster to
another. Yeah. There could be any sorts of disaster. I mean, we've just seen, for example, in Japan, they've just had earthquakes. They're the sort of known disasters that we have. Tsunami as well. I think that was downgraded. It wasn't quite as bad.
Not as bad as they thought. But of course, we have had a pandemic.
Yeah, as well. And, what's going to hit us next? Who knows?
Yes, the existential threats to our existence.
Yeah.
We have suggested we would talk about this before, but we had a bit of an existential issue with the podcast, so we didn't. But we will come back. We guarantee. No, we'll talk about this. Is it going to be another pandemic, alien invasion, zombie apocalypse?
Yeah.
All things are possible, potentially. And there's actually a lot of people studying this, getting a sense of where we are, these black swan events, and whether they will actually destroy us.
Are they going to destroy? Are we going to be prepared? I mean, we certainly weren't prepared for the pandemic. Are we prepared for whatever next is thrown at us? If we lost power, how would we? How many days could we cope without electricity, for example?
Get those candles
ready. This podcast might struggle, for example. We might miss that week.
No, we definitely won't. We'll keep going. Definitely we'll keep going. And next week we'll be back discussing that here on
The Y Curve. See you next week. Thanks for tuning in.
The Y Curve.